You guys should see how quickly Adam Asseri is taking his mic off. He's like, do not say anything backstage, just ripping it off. But regulation in the tech industry is becoming more and more of a thing. The bigger the companies get, the more the law kind of cracks down. But as we all know, the tech world normally asks for forgiveness rather than permission. We're going to learn a little bit more about that in this next panel. So please welcome to the stage Hemant Taneja from General Catalyst, Bradley Tusk from Tusk Holdings, Ted Ullyot from Andreessen Horowitz, and our moderator, Kate Conger.
All right, so how many people in this audience have a company where you expect to face regulation at some point in your process? Show of hands. Maybe you're in self-driving cars, healthcare, anything with independent contractors, or you're selling SaaS products to a regulated industry. Let's see. Okay, well, so these are the guys that you're going to want to talk to about that. Hemant, you've worked in policy a lot. How do you approach policy for startups at General Catalyst?
Yeah, so I got involved in thinking about policy and technology when I was doing clean tech work, which was about a decade ago. And then when you look at the last 5 years, you know, a lot of you are working on companies that are essentially reinventing regulated industries, education, healthcare, financial services, and so on. And, you know, we've got a lot of lessons over the last few years. I mean, think about some of the ones that have become very large and now hitting regulation like Airbnb and Uber. And so our advice to smaller companies today tends to be learn from that, incorporate that thinking early on in your products, and think of sort of policy as a part of the original MVP that you're creating, so that is ingrained in your culture and the organization from the beginning.
Right. Ted, you're taking an approach of bringing policy directly in-house at Andreessen. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's working?
Yeah, I think it starts with what Hemant was saying about how it's pervasive now in many of the companies you guys are working in. If you think about, you know, Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz has talked about software eating the world, and as that happens, as software companies get involved more and more broadly in fintech, in bio, in autonomous vehicles, in sharing economy, you run up against real-world regulatory requirements, and you have to deal with those. So that's pretty pervasive now, and we've found that with the whole range of our investments. And then, you know, so our approach is, you know, Mark talked yesterday, for those of you who heard Mark talk about the approach of the firm about helping founders and helping companies grow and really tap into networks is one of the key things. And he talked about sales networks and marketing networks and so on. And one network that we help our companies think about and tap into and get familiar with is the policy and regulatory environment, whether that's experts in helping companies navigate those, or whether it's actually the politicians, policymakers, and regulators themselves. In Mark's framing, is when you hear about, you know, older, experienced founders coming in, they often have those networks because they spend a lot of time in business dealing with regulators. Many young startup founders don't have that, but we can provide that. That can be part of what the firm provides, as well as Hemant says, encouraging our founders, our innovators to think about these issues, to think about policy and regulatory issues right up front as part of the original thesis, to have a strategy. The strategy from one company to the next may be different, but it's important at least to have a theory as to how you're going to deal with it.
Well, it's almost like you're running a little dating service, right? Where you're setting up founders with policymakers and getting them in the room together before they're in trouble, before they run into a problem.
Yeah, that's the best time to do it, I think, if you're gonna either not wait until there's something incoming and then try to build the relationship there. But again, I think you got to think carefully about what kind of company is this, what regulator are we talking about? Is this federal? Is it state? Is it local? Is it international? And what kind of product do we have? Are we in a heavily regulated area where compliance is something we need to think about right off the bat? Or is this an area where we've got a very strong argument that the regulations don't actually apply to us, and we're going to go ahead on that theory?
Mm-hmm. And Bradley, you're the person that startups go to once they're already in trouble. What's your approach been to dealing with policy?
I mean, ideally, we'll talk to them before they get in trouble. But, you know, a typical day for us is, You've got a startup, a platform, a technology, an idea that's totally new, a regulation that's silent as to that, because if the lawmaker could have thought of that, they'd be the entrepreneur, not a politician. And then an entrenched interest that likes things the way they are. So then kind of the day for us is beat up entrenched interest, convince the regulator that the law as is allows us to do what we want to do, or if not, change the law so that we can do what we want to do. And sometimes it's a very brutal, contentious process, and sometimes we can work it out quietly. But I think, yeah, as Ted just said, the sooner you can deal with it, the better off you are.
Yeah. Hemant, why is policy such a challenge for these small startups and young companies? Why do you think they're running into these problems so frequently?
So, if you look at the NPS of your utilities, your hospitals, your cable companies, your schools, it's all very low. And I think the reason is because there's a lot of regulation in these industries, and the top management of organizations that run these businesses end up regulator-focused as opposed to consumer-focused. So what's happened over the last few years is, a lot of great product teams in the Valley have said, hey, let's think from first principles. What does the customer actually want? What do they really want when it comes to education or, a health service if they're a diabetic and whatnot? And what happens is when you start thinking with that lens, you're breaking the regulations all over the place. And it doesn't even mean there's ill intent there. It's just, it's a new way of offering the kinds of services. And so the safety nets that were in place before are being broken. So what companies tend to do today is, hey, let's get to a scale and then we'll deal with it. And regulators will understand we're here to change the world and we're doing the right thing and they'll believe us. And I don't think it's quite as simple as that, because these regulations are, federal, state, and local, and it's very complex. So if you don't start to do this early on, and bring the regulators along in understanding what you're trying to do, showing them data, being sort of transparent about what you're building and how it's truly aligned with what the purpose of regulation was before, I think it becomes a problem. So you do need to build those skill sets from the beginning into these companies.
So I think startups have been told for a long time, move fast, break things. And it sounds like now you want them to slow down a little bit.
No, it's not that. I think a few companies have gotten to a lot of scale, and regulators didn't quite understand what was going on, and now they're dealing with them. And again, these are great management teams. We're investors in Airbnb together. I mean, they mean well. You've worked a lot with FanDuel and others. But I don't think the companies starting today will have that kind of luxury that let's get to scale and then deal with this. This needs to be dealt with along the way, or you will just have blockers. You'll never get to that point. And that's the point. I think it's a different world today. It's like so mainstream, sort of breaking regulation that, start from the beginning and set it up right.
Yeah. All right, let's talk. Oh, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, Kate, just one to pick up on Hemant's point. I totally agree with that. And one of the reasons it's important to think about this early is it's not simply the regulator who's doing this often of his own volition or her own volition coming in to investigate you. It's often your competitors and the incumbent who will see this. They'll see the threat pretty early on that you pose as a company, and among the tactics they can use to try to get back at you and try to prevent your growth is by raising your profile in an unflattering light with the regulator. So if you can get in and develop that story first, that's very helpful.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So let's talk specifics. Let's talk Airbnb. Some of you guys have invested. Airbnb has had some issues in San Francisco. They've had the billboards that everyone saw kind of saying, congratulations, we paid our taxes. They campaigned for a law here in San Francisco that would cap short-term rentals, and now they're suing over an amendment to the same law. What do you make of Airbnb's strategy?
Me?
Yeah.
Definitely you.
Yeah. I think Airbnb is really a model of many of the things that we think about of how to approach regulators and deal with regulatory problems or regulatory challenges. Some of the things we think about are, and that we encourage our companies to do, for example, are, one, develop what we call your pro-innovation story. I think Airbnb has done a very effective job of this, of developing statistics, numbers, to be able to go into cities that might be skeptical of room sharing, home sharing, and say, hey, listen, this is bringing tourist dollars to parts of the city that otherwise wouldn't get them. Right? We are, as a company, remitting occupancy taxes from homeowners who are renting out their homes. That's also helping you as a city. We're developing areas of the city that otherwise would not be in the core hotel district, whether that's Midtown Manhattan or down here in San Francisco. So that developing the story is a good piece. They've obviously hired a great team, and when we think about it at Andreessen Horowitz, trying to help our companies grow to a point of expertise, when you've got the kind of teams they have with Chris Lehane running government relations, Rob Chestnut, a very experienced GC running, that's great. They've already arrived on that front. Those are very sophisticated tactics. On the challenges they've brought in San Francisco and elsewhere to the lawsuits you were referring to, I think it's very important that companies be prepared to do that. These are legal rights the companies have there. It's Section 230 of the CDA, the Communications Decency Act. It's a 20-year-old federal law. That's one of the pillars of the web. That's one of the pillars of the web as we know it today, of everything that's great about the internet. So it's highly appropriate, I think, for Airbnb to be invoking this. And I think companies shouldn't apologize for doing that and shouldn't hesitate to do that. It shouldn't be the first resort. But if you've gone and made your case to the city or to the state or to the feds and they do something that infringes on your rights, you got to be willing to go ahead and file a lawsuit.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add one thing, which is I don't think these companies have done anything wrong. If you are following the presidential elections, which we all are, I think a lot of these biases are very real in society, right? So when you become a ubiquitous company, those biases start to show up on your own platforms as well. So I think they're doing all the right things to help make sure, the intent behind the regulations that are focused on creating equality and so on are being implemented. But this is just a new in that regard. It's not they're doing it. It's more like how do they help the regulators manage those biases with their algorithms, much like rules and regulations used to do it in the past.
Mm-hmm. So looking back on what they've done in the regulatory space, are there things that you think they could have done differently or should have done differently?
It's the point that I was making earlier. I think they could have started to invest in this even sooner. That's probably the one place where they've gone and got some of the best people in the world to be part of the team now. I think they're doing transparent work. They're encouraging the community to do the right things. They're doing all the right things today. But as I said, this was so new 6, 7, 8 years ago that we just, as an ecosystem here, didn't take these things as seriously as perhaps the next generation of companies should and do it earlier.
Yeah, and Bradley, you've had a lot of success pushing for changes in laws, both with Uber and FanDuel, by mobilizing their own user bases to advocate on the company's behalf. How do you get the user base involved to speak up for a company?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need a few things. One is scale helps a lot, and Uber, obviously, just by having so many customers in each market, can overwhelm a city council person, a state rep, a state senator pretty quickly. I think one challenge that Airbnb is going to have is, by definition, the scale on their network are the guests who are not voters in the jurisdiction where the regulatory challenge is taking place, and mobilizing the hosts, A, just not as many people as Uber riders, and B, if there's regulatory ambiguity, some people get anxious about raising their hand and saying, hey, I'm doing this. And so Uber has the advantage of, one, a big structural inherent base, two, a really good juxtaposition. So basically, no one really likes taxis anywhere. Some cities are a little better, some are a little worse, and no one likes taxi medallion owners. They like them even less than the taxis themselves. So fighting them in that contrast is a lot easier and better. Again, if you're Airbnb, affordable housing advocates don't seem like bad guys, right? So it's just a much harder road, path to take. For FanDuel and DraftKings combined in the US and Canada, they have about 5 million customers, which is a lot, nowhere near the scale of an Uber, but they're super passionate, right? And so you go to a state rep and say, these 2,300 people in your district play daily fantasy sports. They probably don't even know who you are. They're not voters. But if you take this away from them, we're going to make sure they do. And then they're going to come out to vote against you because they're pissed off. And especially because fantasy sports is just not a big ideological issue one way or the other. The typical reaction is like, all right, screw it. I don't need to have this problem. I'm just going to move it. But one of the real lessons here is you've got to make it really easy for the customer to advocate, right? So when you go on the Uber platform, you go on the FanDuel platform, in the middle of one of these fights in that particular jurisdiction, it's right there. You're going on there to do your play games or to order a car. But you're informed right away. You press one button, it knows who your council member it is, it knows who your state senator it is, it reaches them, and that's what works. And what's amazing is, having spent the last sort of 5-6 years doing this now for Uber and FanDuel and others, it is easier to get people to advocate on behalf of a for-profit company than it is to go out and vote in their own interests.
And you mentioned voting. You're working on a project actually to make people get out and vote in their own best interest.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think, if there's one takeaway, because I'm the kind of the political guy in the room, is politicians are not irrational. They just respond to a different set of incentives than people in tech. So they care about votes, money, press, right? That's what really matters to them. And right now, because so few people vote in most elections, they know that there's a very narrow constituency that's either going to vote or is going to make, spend a lot of money in their campaign, and that's who they're catering to. And if you had a much broader application where more and more people were voting, they'd have to be responsive to a much broader audience. They're going to adapt their behavior to whatever the incentives are. We just have all the wrong incentives, and there's no reason why, if you can advocate for Uber or FanDuel on your phone, that you shouldn't be able to vote. And so one of the things that we're working on is, creating a challenge where we will provide both funding and political help for someone who can come up with a platform where people can A, vote securely, B, preserve the anonymity of your vote, because you have to both know who you are, but then not reveal who you just voted for. And then we've got to find some jurisdictions that are willing to take a chance on a pilot program where they will start to allow experiments around mobile voting. And look, this is probably a couple of decade-long process to finally get there. But once we do, that's the best solution to a lot of the dysfunction in our system right now.
Given all the concerns that have been raised about security in this election, the hack of the DNC, Russia's potential involvement in that, do you think that secure voting on your phone is a thing that's even possible?
Yeah, of course it is, right? I mean, there are things that people in this room do every day that are a lot more technically complicated than voting on their phone. I mean, you guys would probably just laugh at the notion that you couldn't sort of deliver a secure vote. So it's definitely possible. And keep in mind, so a presidential election gets a lot of attention. You get about 60% participation. But next year, you're going to have mayoral elections all over the country, and it's going to fall to like 10 to 20% participation. And these are the people who actually impact your lives the most on a day-to-day basis. So, the notion of Russians hacking and all of that at most comes into play once every 4 years, or in our case, because Trump is for better and a lot for worse, a once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon, once a generation. So, no, I don't think those are real-world concerns.
So you think Russia's not trying to hack our mayoral elections?
Probably. My guess is that they're not really aware of when the primary is and who's running and things like that.
Got it. And I think, part of this whole conversation is getting laws up to date with technology, or, bringing the election online. But part of this is companies earning that trust. If we have a company making an election system, we have to be able to trust that company. Hemant, how can investors encourage algorithmic transparency in their companies and try to get companies to be more transparent in general so that users can trust them?
Yeah, it's first of all, I think it needs to be more and more of a board level conversation, in my opinion. The challenge is companies don't want to share the data because it's their secret sauce. It's something that they're careful about, so folks aren't reverse engineering what they're doing. But there needs to be a mechanism where you can actually show, the algorithms that are being used are not simply for profit maximization, because that's not how, businesses are allowed to operate, going back to the point about biases. If you're a marketplace, how do we make sure these algorithms are not letting those biases persist, even though those biases would actually maximize their profits, because those are very real in society. So sort of creating that transparency so that regulators can see it, and frankly, it shouldn't be regulators being humans anymore. It probably should be software-based watchdogs that the government's creating that can then sort of assess and evaluate these algorithms. But that whole system needs to get created. I mean, you were sort of talking about the dating service between politicians and entrepreneurs here, but I do think a real conversation does need to exist on how we're going to create this, because the tech community here is getting further and further ahead, more and more sophisticated in how we run our lives using algorithms, and DC and state and local regulators are just not catching up at all. I mean, the gap in understanding is widening, and we need to solve for that.
Yeah, I think you raised a good point of just how sophisticated technology is becoming in comparison to the policy world. And I think that can lead some policymakers to feel like they're being steamrolled by tech. tech, or that tech is just kind of coming in, burning the city down. How can companies earn the trust and really build those relationships with the people who are making policy?
I think you're right about that risk, Kate, and I think that's part of the reason that it's important to make these relationships early on, and to take a page out of the Facebook playbook. When I was there as general counsel, we often were, for a while, we were on the receiving end of inquiries from government regulators. We'd roll out a new product, and all of a sudden, we get a complaint from one of the privacy groups. We get an investigation. That would happen. That's not a good sequence to move in. That holds you back. It can even derail some products from time to time, at least delay them. What we started doing, and I think gets to your point, was going in to, for example, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, or to a state attorney general who we knew was focused on this area, and saying, here's a new feature that we're going to roll out, where that's, let's say it's check-ins, location tagging, let's say it's facial recognition, and here's what we're doing, here's all the privacy issues that we think this raises, here's how we've tried to safeguard privacy and address the legitimate interests of both users, most important, but also regulators on this, and here's our case. We're not asking for permission. You're still free to come after us at some point, but by giving our version of the story, the correct version, the actual facts, as opposed to waiting for somebody to see this and say, wow, what's going on, and spin a worst case scenario. You can actually, there are, both among policymakers and regulators, there are plenty of people who have good tech savvy, and especially now that's become more of a thing to go to Washington from Silicon Valley. So there are people you can reach and explain what you're doing and explain the safeguards you put in place. I think that kind of thing is highly valuable. Did that prevent every subsequent inquiry and investigation to us? Absolutely not. But at least there we were playing on a fair field where the regulator knew what we were trying to do and all the safeguards we had in place. And I think that kind of approach is quite important.
Yeah. Well, Josh was just up here chatting with Facebook about, algorithmic transparency and how is Facebook making those decisions to remove a news story or remove a video. Yeah. Do you think that Facebook can be more transparent about how it's governing its newsfeed?
I think Adam addressed that just now. He's closest to it these days. I think they've done a nice job of working through the issues as they've arisen, but I think he addressed it pretty well.
I think one thing to realize, these companies have become the next generation utilities so fast. Right? They're very young, and so I do think there's going to be sort of a maturation process. There's no ill intent here, where we all figure this out together as an ecosystem as to how do you implement that algorithmic transparency. I don't think anybody could have anticipated this was even going to be a need 5-7 years ago. So, I don't want to cast people as though they're doing wrong things necessarily.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think a lot of our founders here in the audience are pretty young. What advice would you give to small companies that maybe don't have a general counsel, maybe don't have a policy team, but want to challenge laws that are governing their industry? Maybe we just go down the road.
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned, sort of having worked on policy work for about a decade, is the message and the messenger are really important. Remember, if you're going and you're trying to advocate for something that's good for your business, I don't think that's the message that the regulator really cares about. You have to talk about how it's aligned with the broader goals that regulation agency is working on, and you also need to think about who should go deliver that message. If it's you delivering on behalf of your company versus there's a neutral organization that's doing it on behalf of many companies like you in your ecosystem, it's just perceived differently. And if the message is about your profits versus job creation and economic, sort of prosperity in the regions under discussion, it's different how it gets perceived. So it's very important to think about those two things as you develop your strategy for political affairs.
Yeah. And I would say this notion that there's a bright line answer to should you beg for forgiveness or ask for permission is kind of crazy. It all really depends on the context, the jurisdiction. And I think you have to understand that, right? You can't just say, oh, I saw some other company do it this way, so I'm going to either go in proactively or I'm just going to fight them or whatever it is. For example, begging a random regulator for forgiveness is a lot different than begging a U.S. attorney for forgiveness, right? And this is all fun and everyone's breaking things, but I'm sure most people here don't have any interest in being put on trial. So you've got to really understand what are the politics of that jurisdiction, who are the regulators, who are the entrenched interests, what kind of political influence do they have, what are the ramifications if you just go ahead and do it, or if you were to go in first and ask, what kind of support can you mobilize from your customers and from the broader world, and you've just got to be thoughtful about it. You don't necessarily have to have a policy team or a GC or us, but you've got to at least understand the questions that you're grappling with, and the fact that you have, you know, a really great platform, or that you went to Stanford or YC, like, so what? Like, the political world could care less, and you have to at least have the sophistication to both know what to ask and know what you don't know.
So it sounds like you're encouraging companies to go a little bit into opposition research.
Sometimes Oppo can be a very helpful tool, but at the very least, you know, I'm asking them to be thoughtful in looking at the challenges they're going to face. Most companies these days are being created in spaces that are regulated in some way, and just like you're focused on, you know, your tech, your team, your fundraising, everything else, if you're going to be in a regulated space, you've got to understand what you're getting into.
Got it. And Ted, what about you? What advice would you have for a young company that wants to challenge some regulation, some law, and make a change? 3
things. I would say, just, this gets to Bradley's point, understand the situation. And a point I made earlier of you know, the tactics can vary depending on what you are doing, what laws you're facing, and who the decision makers are. So first of all, understand that. There's no one size fits all in this. Secondly, build allies. I think it's very important. Building allies, that's, whether it's an industry coalition or law professors, something like this. You look at the Airbnb challenges, the Section 230 challenges they filed. I thought it was very effective that along with their own filing, they have EFF coming in. That's, I mean, to have EFF behind you on this, that's huge. That shows that it's not just a company that's out for it. It's, you know, it's EFF with all of the history of that organization and the great brand and the great tradition that EFF has built up of protecting users and protecting privacy and protecting the web. They've also got prominent law professors. They've put in a couple letters to New York State with many entrepreneurs, many of whom are probably in this room, but many entrepreneurs signing on and many big companies signing on. I think those sorts of allies to show this is not simply us doing this, this is a broader issue. And then also, again, making that pro-innovation case, saying, here's why, if your goal of the law and the regulation, your consumer protection regime is this, here's how we actually further that goal, and why this law is not necessary or should be changed, or you should not adopt this provision. I think that whole package.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you guys very much for being here. It's really a pleasure to chat with you a little bit, and hopefully some of these guys can grab you after and get your advice as well.
Sure.
Thanks, Kate.
All right.
Cool.
Thank you.